Hi, Julia. Welcome to the Empowered Nutrition Podcast. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like we have so much in common. It's like I'm surprised we haven't met at some point already.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to be able to meet you. I've listened to several episodes of your podcast on various topics, so I feel honored to
See,
be invited on to talk to you.
it's an honor to talk with you because even though I think, and we'll get into it, but I think there's been some shifts in terms of women's kind of thinking around nutrition and muscle. I think we still have so far to go. So thank you for the fight
Mhm.
you're fighting.
Yeah, it's my mission, and I'm so passionate about the work I'm doing, and so grateful to be in the position I'm in. So it makes it
Yeah.
really easy to wake up every day and get to work. So
Yeah, so tell me your story. You're obviously a nutrition professional, but you somehow don't promote veganism and calorie cutting and um, eating low fat diets. How did you get to where you are?
yeah, that's I love how you introduce that. Set me up perfectly. Um,
Go.
So I guess my entry into the nutrition world really came from a personal interest standpoint, as most nutritionists will tell you. They didn't get
Mhm.
into nutrition because they've always like wanted to help other people with their nutrition. It really came from like a deep desire to understand how to eat for themselves. And then
Yeah.
that sort of like snowballed into, well, I feel like I can help others, really empower them to find a way of eating that works for them. So that is really where I came from. In my early 20s, I was sort of on this like interesting search for like kind of the best way to live that would make me feel the healthiest and most resilient kind of version of myself. So I started getting into, and I don't know if you're familiar with this world, but like permaculture, growing your own food, like homesteading, real like
Mm.
self sufficiency stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I would classify myself as a libertarian per se, but I'm a very big proponent of like autonomy and uh, kind of self sufficiency. Like I view that as a really high value for me. I want to be able to be
Hmm.
as capable as possible to survive on my own without depending on institutions and other people to support me.
Yeah.
So I really had this like romantic relationship with like self-sufficiency for a while.
Sure.
And it was in my early 20s. So please know that I've like come back down to earth after a few years. But in my early 20s, I
Like
was really
having kids will
exploring.
do that. You're like,
Yeah,
okay, I'm
yeah.
gonna rest a little bit, stay alive.
Exactly, yeah. But in my early 20s, I really was like, you know, what is this whole world of like homesteading, growing your own food? It's like this is the healthiest food you could eat because you're growing it yourself. It's in
Yeah.
soil that you manage. It's like thinking about nose to tail type eating and farm to table type eating. That
Mhm.
really inspired me. And so I just kind of dabbled in that as an interest for several years. And then in my mid 20s, I had the opportunity to purchase like this little grocery store that I saw so much potential in to be able to be sort of like this little organic kind of local store that promoted supporting the regional economy, the regional food economy. So
Yeah.
another one of my high values is like I just really hate the idea that uh, food is centralized and that right now in the US, you know, most of our food travels like 2,500 miles just to get from where it's grown to your plate. And that's like
Mhm.
an average. So I really became interested in this like regional food kind of support system. And I wanted to use my store to build that where I lived.
Wow.
And then after a few years, I met my husband, who is a bison rancher, and just so happened that he was selling his bison meat, and I ended up selling it in my store. So that's how we got connected. So we like share a lot of mutual interests and passions around
Yeah.
growing food, nutrient dense food, regenerative agriculture, and all of that. But that was like my foray into it, and then all the while I'm having this like personal evolution of like how to eat best for me. And I think
Mhm.
it really came to like this beautiful coalescence of concepts with like the regenerative egg, kind of grass fed, high quality animal proteins um, that intersected with this like kind of protein forward, muscle centric approach to nutrition that my now kind of boss and the lady I work for, named Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, has
Mhm.
been sort of developing and conceptualizing over the last several years.
Yeah.
And so when I found her, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the holy grail of all the things I'm interested and passionate about that are all coming together in this one thing. I need to reach out to this woman and work for her. And so I was able to do that. At the time, our practice, or her practice, didn't have a nutritionist on staff.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so I was able to like start up our nutrition program as the first nutritionist, and we've really evolved since then. That was only a couple of years ago. Now we have a second nutritionist, and things are really growing. So yeah, that in a long backstory is how I got to where I am. And it really was just the pursuit of things that I was really passionate about and I find are very important. And then nutrition as it relates to my own personal journey.
Yeah, I love that. It's so good. One thing you said that stuck out to me is nutrient density, and I think if there's one thing, tell me what you think about this, and it's connected, obviously, to everything else you
Mhm.
said. But if there's one thing that I think is less on the radar of women than muscle, it might be nutrient density and the importance of that. Like if you say it, they'll probably just nod and agree with you, but I feel like they don't really understand really what that means or how honestly poorly they're doing on that, even if they're eating a pretty like healthy diet in their own minds. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, it is a concept that's very important because what if you think about the fundamental reason why we eat, it's to acquire nutrients.
Hmm.
And what's happened over the years as our soils have become depleted is the food that we're eating is no longer as nutrient dense as it used to be, partly because
Hmm.
there's not enough minerals and nutrients held in the soil, but also because when food gets picked, it might be like, well, now they pick food that's like not quite ripe and allow it to ripen over time. But the longer a food stays off sort of the vine or the plant or wherever it comes from, and gets to your plate, the less nutrition it actually holds over time.
Yeah.
So between all of these things, the food that we're eating, even though we might think it has like the most nutrition possible, a lot has changed since, our grandparents or our great grandparents era,
Hmm.
in terms of food quality, in my opinion. And so that is like a challenge that is systemic and something that we can't really fight against. But I think just by nature, our food is like lower quality. And then what
Yeah.
tends to happen is and I don't know what your position is on the protein leverage hypothesis, but basically we have to eat to satisfy nutritional requirements in the body. And if
Hmm.
our food is less nutrient dense, we just have to eat more of it. And that means it
Hmm.
puts us in a situation where we're in a calorie surplus, or we're overeating just to acquire the nutrients that we need.
Yeah.
I've heard some statistics that, like you'd need to eat the equivalent of 7 oranges to get the same vitamin C 50 years ago, in one orange, or like 2 pounds of meat to get the same nutrient density as a 1 pound 50 or 100 years ago. So
Wow.
there is a huge discrepancy now in the nutrient content of food. And it's only getting worse as agriculture continues to be extractive and based on inputs of fertilizers and additives that further deplete the soil rather than thinking about
Yeah.
soil first.
Totally. That's huge.
Hmm.
And then like I think the other main issue, tell me what you think though, is if I go up to like just kind of an average like patient that we have, that's a woman maybe like, that walks into our clinic and we eats pretty well and doesn't understand what the problem is. Like I eat healthy, what's the deal with my health problems? If I say, okay, what do you think are the most nutrient dense foods? My guess is that she would say something like fruits and vegetables, but actually, I mean, what maybe you should go with this of like that is like not even on my probably top 10. Like, what would you say?
Right. I do think that, so red meat, probably organ meats, are
Yeah.
up there in terms of nutrient density. If we look at like the overall kind of aggregate of all nutrients they would provide, I would say those are like my top two. And put like seafood and some other like sea-based
Hmm.
foods in there as well.
Yeah.
But um, you know, I do notice that the higher people's fiber intake, the higher their diet quality. And when I
Yeah.
use the word diet quality, my definition of diet quality is how close are you getting to around the recommended daily allowance for every
Hmm.
vitamin and mineral. And so I do
Hmm.
notice that those individuals who who prioritize high quality animal proteins. So eating red meat, eating fish, eating a wide variety of those types of foods.
Mhm.
I mean, organ meats would be like a total bonus, which not a lot of people do, but I
Yeah. Or
still
even just
love to talk. Or
yeah.
even eggs. Yeah, eggs too go in there.
Yeah.
Um, and then they also meet their fiber requirement. So like they're
Yeah.
getting around 25 grams of fiber a day. That is a real sweet combination where
Yeah.
you're getting like the most nutrient dense sort of diet. So for me, diet quality we focus on a lot in my practice. It sounds like you do too. It's
Yeah.
like we're not just talking about macronutrients. Macronutrients is only the first step. We want to make sure that people are meeting their macronutrient needs, which is carbohydrates, fats, and protein, and also watching the calories they take in, because if you're consistently overeating, that's going to lead to a myriad of issues. Um, but then secondarily, once we have that figured out, it is all focused on diet quality, nutrient density. Are you
Yeah.
getting all the micronutrients that you need to function? Um,
Yeah.
and I think
Don't
part,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, don't get me wrong, I'm not like a proponent of a carnivore diet at all. We're saying like fiber, one of the top 3 things that needs to happen, high on plants for sure.
Hmm.
I'm more just talking about this kind of thing I noticed where it's like culturally, I think women are so entrenched into like this thinking of these like foods having been vilified that are the more nutrient dense, especially the animal foods. It's like they'll give themselves they won't if they're low on like say plants and fiber, they know that there's a problem and they'll totally be on board if you say, hey, we need to work on this, no problem. But if you say something like, hey, like, oh, they'll totally give themselves a pass if they're like, yeah, I just don't eat red meat and I don't eat
Right,
eggs and I don't eat fish because I just don't like seafood. And like you kind of have to do some convincing to get them
totally.
to agree with you that that's a problem.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And, media and more recent epidemiology that's been coming out is not helping us in this way. I don't
Yeah.
know if you've seen,
Yeah.
The Lancet, which is a journal that is, well respected. It has a high impact factor. It's referenced often by the media. It's come out in the last, I don't know, I think year, saying red meat is associated with not only cancer, but cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, believe it or not.
Such a joke.
So it's really hard for I think the average person to read all the things that they're reading in the media,
Yeah.
and largely what they're seeing from government dietary guidelines and recommendations coming from the government,
Mhm.
and what's actually true based on emerging science and things we know to be true because we're clinicians who work with people day in and day out, and we can see the difference that the impact that happens when somebody starts incorporating some red meat into their diet, and how much better their diet quality then becomes, and how much better they sometimes feel. And
Yeah.
you did talk about the carnivore diet being you're not a huge proponent, but I do think there are some people out there who really do benefit from a carnivore style diet for certain periods of time, or to address like, specific gut issues. I'm sure you've used the carnivore diet somewhat therapeutically in practice. That's how I would use it anyways, as a temporary thing. Because it is so nutrient dense, um, it's a way to treat certain like gut issues and avoid some problematic foods while still maintaining really high nutrient density.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel like it's a good litmus test. Like if you feel better on a
Hmm.
carnivore diet, you clearly have a health problem that needs to be addressed,
Totally.
and it's probably your gut health.
Yeah.
If you really, really are specialized in gut health, which obviously not everybody can be, you have better ways of addressing that than by keeping somebody on a carnivore diet. But
Yeah. I
um,
think I use the wrong term
yeah,
there. I wouldn't say it's like a therapeutic diet. It is more like a symptom management tool.
right. It can totally exactly. A lot of
Yeah.
people feel dramatically better when they go on that. I think the mistake that happens there, though, is that they interpret that as meaning, therefore, it is the ideal human diet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's actually just that's the case with a lot of therapeutic diets. It's maybe not the ideal human diet, but you feel better on it temporarily. In fact, a lot of people who went on vegan diets have told me that they felt better initially because they
Totally.
went from eating a bunch of processed junk to eating like cleaner, more whole foods, but
Mhm.
any complete diet catches up with you in the long run. So if that's your really like, it's not a sign that you've discovered the ideal human diet, need to jump on
Right.
Instagram and like tell the whole world. It's a sign that you had some kind of underlying problem in terms of the way you were eating or with your health that now needs to be
Yeah.
addressed. But it's hard for people to get help with that. So I can see why they just stay on these diets.
Yeah. And then, I mean, concurrent to that, not only about symptomology, but a lot of the time, what comes with these types of diets, elimination diets, carnivore diet being, I would consider it like a kind of elimination
Yeah,
diet.
it is. It
Um,
totally is.
pe- People tend to lose weight as well because
Right.
I mean, it's a lot easier to be calorically restricted when you're on a really
Yeah,
restricted
of
diet.
course.
So then they lose a bunch of weight and they think like this is the key to my weight loss when really it was just sort of the default calorie restriction
Of
that came with the
course.
diet. So it's really hard to parse all of these things out, and that's part of why, the epidemiology is so hard to makes it challenging for us because there is this idea of like healthy user bias that goes into all of these types of studies.
Of course.
People who are eating less red meat are obviously going to be more health conscious. They're going to be drinking less. They're probably not smoking. They're probably not eating fast food. And, as much as you can control for those in the statistical analysis of those studies, you can't remove the influence of those factors.
Right.
And you can't remove them entirely. So,
Right.
um, it just paints when we take those types of studies and the media blows them up as if they're conclusive and causal in
Yeah,
nature rather than correlational. It really gives people this misconception that there is like a cause and effect to some of this stuff when really there isn't at all.
exactly. It's their oldest trick in the book and they still get away with it. It's wild.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we do a lot that I mean, with my work with Dr. Lyon and even in clinic, like you said, is a lot about trying to explain this to people
Yeah.
and we have a podcast as well, or she has a podcast as well, where a lot of guests are coming on that are challenging the epidemiology and talking about how we need to think about it differently, and more randomized controlled trials are coming out that are showing otherwise or showing a kind of like the opposite effect that some of these epidemiology studies are showing. So yeah, it's an interesting time, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you want to even get into this, but it's going to be very interesting in terms of like, I think we're going to be seeing some pretty significant changes with like the FDA and like the way the federal government is involved in like nutrition guidelines and how research funding starts to flow with like the new administration here in the United
Yeah.
States. And so like I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen, but I can tell you like I don't know if you're seeing this, but I'm in a bunch of these dietitian groups and I'm cracking up because they're like freaking out over it, how it's going to be like such a disaster when their precious like dietary guidelines for Americans get like interfered with. I'm like, you
Well, the
think it's gonna
crazy
be
thing
bad?
is there is a so I've been watching on the periphery because I'm Canadian, and so I mean
Yeah,
I'm hopeful though because is like our culture and some
right.
of our stuff is really informed by what happens down there
Of
with you
course.
guys. So, but I am watching on the periphery. I think it's interesting, the integration of RFK and how
Right.
he's sort of come in as an advocate now, which I definitely appreciate, and his perspective is unique. And I agree with him on a lot of things, but yeah, it'll be I mean, there is a new dietary guidelines coming out for 2025 that basically already set. Like, they're
Yeah.
finalizing the details of the dietary guidelines. So, um, I don't know if much I mean, in the 4 years that Trump is coming in, and the new administration, whatever, I don't know how much can change given new dietary guidelines are coming out
Yeah.
next year.
Right.
I do know that based on what I know about the new dietary guidelines, they are promoting kind of this more precision, individualized approach to nutrition. But I
Yeah.
still don't think they're as like, I still think they're really, really hesitant about the red meat. They're definitely
Oh
going to be
yeah.
lower in grains, I think, and less carbohydrate overall. But I definitely think they're still hesitant to put forward red meat and high quality animal proteins as like a staple, as more of like a focus
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree. I agree. On the topic of RFK Jr., I also agree with a lot of things he says. I don't know. I don't have deep expertise in some of the things he says. So some of the
Mhm.
things he says are wrong. I think that's likely. He said a lot of stuff, but generally, I think one of the main things he's highlighting that I like is that his legal career was bringing these cases to court where he just showed that, okay, the FDA is in bed with industry and
Mhm.
it's deep.
Yeah.
It's affecting everything they do. And
Yeah.
so, when it comes to, so like bringing up things like food additives and chemicals and like things in food that are not just the dietary guidelines for Americans don't speak to like any of that at all, but
No.
I
No.
do think it, and like what you brought also up earlier about like the nutrient density of our food and the quality of our soils and the impact of that. I think it's really important to start to highlight that, because if we simply just focus on like, the dietary guidelines for Americans are heavily influenced by industry, right? So when you say, okay, it's going to be less grain, is it? Because
Yeah.
that would be a big fight. The grain industry is gigantic, and
Mhm.
so I think it's a really valuable thing that concept that they're bringing of like, why don't we separate this conflict of interest that exists between the agency of the government that should be giving the guidance and the legal protections for the health of the population versus all these industries that have a financial interest in just selling more of their like grain product or whatever
Mhm.
their product
Mhm.
or their medication or whatever. Like, how are these two things so intimately in bed with each other?
Yeah, yeah, and one thing he does call out a lot is, like, the very intense subsidization of agriculture as it is now,
Right. Right.
and, a shift in the way that we think about agriculture. A lot of people just say, like, "We can't shift it because it can't scale or because the transition would be too hard." Well, what people don't realize is just how much money the government is giving to make the
Mhm.
current system that we have actually still function. And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, the farmers, the ranchers, they're not really coming out on top. They're actually, as important as they are to society, they're probably like the bottom of the barrel in terms of who's benefiting in this in this supply chain.
Mhm.
So the whole thing just needs to get tipped over on its head and and assessed and kind of rebuilt from the bottom up. In my opinion, it would take a really bold and brave individual
Yeah.
to start that process and even
Yeah.
have those conversations. But to me, the system as it is broken because we're literally supporting it with band-aids and tensor bandages and crutches and like all the support
Yeah.
that we could possibly give it. So, I mean, it's gonna break at some point.
Yeah, I don't know how it's gonna go because I mean this is getting way too like big maybe, but it's the way I see it is kind of like, okay, well, there's like severe like implications of like, let's say we said, okay, the US government needs to stop subsidizing all these industries that put adverse influences on the American diet. So like growing tons of soy, growing tons of corn, growing tons of wheat, right?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Okay, well, you do stop doing that, food is gonna become massively more expensive, right? It's more
Yes,
expensive in other first world countries. We have, like, super
yes.
cheap food, even after the record inflation we've had. Well, Americans already are mad about food prices, like, when food prices massively increase, because now we've shifted away from, like, basically favoring processed, refined foods, because that's where most of those crops go, and now it's
Mhm.
like, "Oh, we're going back to like hundreds of years ago where like the cheapest food is like raw ingredients and you have to make your own food." Well, to me, our whole like society has shifted now to where like there's no one in the home that has the time
Totally.
to make meals out of raw ingredients multiple times a day, even not even once a day. Like women are stretched so thin because we've got
Mhm.
to like raise kids, we've got to hold down a full-time job, we've got to self-care, we've got to exercise, we've got to like try to have a hobby, we've got to like keep our marriage going. It's just like our society is kind of like shifted to where like the way that women survive and even try to make it is by kind of taking these shortcuts that are
Right.
enabled by processed foods and by the subsidization of these like crops. So I'm not really sure that like it could almost go anti-woman, I think, if you, like,
Mhm,
stop
mhm.
doing this because, well, now what are women supposed to do? They're supposed to, like, quit their job so they can, like, spend 4 hours a day cooking. Now they don't have enough money to pay their mortgage and, like, you know what I mean? Like, it
Yeah.
kinda you gotta think about stuff like that.
Yeah, I know. It's not a problem I have the answer to because it is
Yeah.
so pervasive, and
Yeah.
and every single person eats. So it is like fundamental to every single human life in the country, on the
Mhm.
planet. And I mean, we've gone so far, I think, one way that it will be difficult to even come somewhere centrally where we're a bit more conscious about our land and quality, because eventually I think it just gets to the point where we put ourselves in a little bit of a pickle, like
Yeah.
in terms of food quality. I mean, we've already sort of seen it. We're getting to this point where without the saving grace of these weight loss drugs, the obesity epidemic is going to continue to grow.
Mhm.
If the pharmaceutical industry comes in and innovates and helps us bring, I've been reading lately that we've passed peak obesity. We're kind of like on the way down now. But the only reason is because of these GLP-1 agonists. So
Yeah.
it's like, you know,
It's not a
we're,
peak. It's just that something a miracle happened.
yes, it's
Yeah.
like
A natural peak, I mean. Yeah.
yeah, we're sort of at the precipice. I mean, we've pushed ourselves to this point where um, our health is starting to suffer as a result of the way that we're designing and growing our food. So, I mean, this
Yeah.
is a crazy, deep, systemic
It is.
topic that, I mean, I'm not even really an expert in it per se, but I am very interested and passionate about it. But I do think it has pushed our society, and we are seeing the effects of you know two two centuries of doing things this way. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I mean, I guess like as both of us as nutrition professionals that work primarily with women, I think it's like, yeah, you can be aware of these things and know about it, not know what the answer is. But when you have that like n equals one person in front of you, that person has the ability to shift their nutrition. I do still feel like even on an individual level, though, that is a common friction point of like, okay, well, our whole lifestyle is dependent on processed foods, even quote unquote healthy processed foods, like a loaf of
mhm,
whole grain bread, for example, or like
yeah.
pre-cooked grilled chicken tenders that you heat up in the oven or something.
Mhm.
Um, it's tough even for that one woman to figure out, okay, so what? Now I'm supposed to cook everything from scratch, but still work full time and like take care of my kids' homework and their sports and everything. I think it's really tough.
It is. It's definitely doable. I think it requires intentionality and priority.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm not sensitive to every single person's situation. I am one of those people. I am a working mom full time.
Yeah.
I've got 2 kids. Um, although I come from the vantage that food and my family's health is the most important thing, because if we don't have our health, we have nothing.
Yeah.
So that's what I kind of plan our whole life around. That's how we prioritize our finances. Even, I will be really, really kind of diligent about not sort of buying clothes I don't need, or
Yeah.
buying my kids more toys made of plastic. But I will never like scoff at paying money for high quality food. So
Yeah.
it's just about reprioritizing, I think. I don't think it's
Mhm.
impossible. I definitely think it's difficult, but it does kind of require you to decide, what are the important things in your life and how do you want to place it on the hierarchy. Even how you manage your time.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of time to be like a lot of spare time, but we do also waste a lot of time on our phones and doing things that
Yeah.
aren't value add. So really assessing, how do I spend my time? I spend most of my free time cooking food for my family.
Same.
So
Same.
yeah,
I was 5:30 this morning putting in that Instant Pot. Yep. Yeah,
exactly.
I
So
agree.
I do think
It's
it's
not
possible.
impossible, but it's kinda like it's a big shift for people to kinda realize like, "Oh, this isn't just that I get on some kind of like there's some magic macro ratio. It's really a lifestyle shift that is you have to be a lot more in it than I think people like would like.
Mhm.
They'd like to just have some kind of like simple thing they can do, like a hack, but really it is a lifestyle. And I think it's probably an unpopular opinion to say that, but just over many years of doing this, I've come to that of, if you're not going to do the lifestyle, it's not going to work. There's no cheat code.
No, there's no cheat code, and you will end up paying for it at some point with time,
Yeah.
because being sick is also really time consuming.
Yeah.
So It's like you wanna, and I do believe, you know, food is not necessarily medicine. I don't love when people say that, but food is definitely a preventative medicine. So if
Mhm.
you are able to feed your family whole nutrient dense foods, making sure that your kids aren't eating, you know, whatever the average 81 grams of sugar per day, trying to minimize that
Yeah.
as much as possible. You are going to benefit in the long run from life actually being somewhat easier down the road, and you having more time for things you enjoy because you are healthy. And so I think it is somewhat like a savings account. You are making an investment in your health in the same way as
Mhm.
you'd make an investment in like your RSPs.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about nutrient density is I find that it creates energy in a way in a real sense for people. Like they
Hmm.
won't really feel they'll feel more energetic and they'll generally feel better and that will generate more ability to spend more time on your food and a sort of like feed forward cycle to some level.
I totally agree with that. It's like when you get someone to a position where physiologically you know, their mitochondria are functioning properly, they're able to literally create energy in their cells more efficiently. And that comes from nutrient density, but also prioritizing physical activity and
Mhm.
resistance training and building muscle, in my opinion. Um, the easier, you know, the more capacity you have just in general.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it feeds into that thing we talked about of just getting away from this idea of like, what do I need to cut out? What do I need to limit? How much do I need to calorie cut? And thinking that paradigm shift of like what nutrients do I need to add to feel better and function better and like give my body
Yes.
the machine like the pieces that it needs.
Mhm.
Um,
And that's originally kind of what I felt was one of Dr. Lyon's really compelling messages was she's like, we oh, I think I'm cutting out.
no, you sound good.
Oh, do I?
Yeah.
Um, she one of Dr. Lyon's really compelling messages is she's like, "Why are we focused so much on what we have to lose? We need to
Yeah.
focus on what we have to gain." And this whole dichotomy is a really interesting mindset shift that I think a lot of women need to make. Instead of being so scarcity focused, what can I eliminate from my diet? How can I restrict myself? um,
Yeah.
I need to shed pounds and be small. It's like let's shift to an abundance mindset, a growth oriented mindset where we're really trying to build something positive and focus on
Yes.
adding, like you said, adding in the things that we need in order to function well. Because I think when you shift the focus to that, it is so much more positive, first of all, because going in trying to like with a negative frame of mind where you're trying to restrict and limit and cut and shrink is like that
Mhm.
is a very reductive kind of negative mindset to be in. But if you shift to sort of like this growth oriented thing where you're adding in and including and maybe reprioritizing to accommodate that, I think it's a much more healthy mindset, and psychologically it makes it a lot easier to even adopt behavior change that's required to do those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. A mindset of abundance. What can I gain? What can I grow? And speaking of which, also physically, so we can't not talk about muscle and muscle centric medicine. Do you mind just kind of um, introducing that? And if you can, try to tie in, like if I find that if I say to a woman, like it's important for you to have muscle, and they'll say absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. But then when we start to get into what that means and like what they need to do in order to get it, it's very difficult to get them to go there. So tell maybe you could tie that in, but why is muscle so important to women, and maybe go from there.
Yeah, I think partly because so it's really important for women out the gate because societally we sort of been led to believe that this isn't something that we need or desire. Um, and so like standards about around beauty and stuff like that don't really involve like being highly muscled. So I think that's partly why it needs to be overemphasized for women, but I think this applies to both women and men. It is not just a women conversation. It's every single person. But um, the way that we frame it in our practice is, you know, muscle is sort of the target for our health. So muscle is not only an organ system that helps us like move. It's not just for locomotion and being able to like move your body, but it is both metabolically active active from an endocrinologic standpoint. So it releases chemicals into the body that crosstalk with all of our organs and interface and modulate a lot of things, including our immune system. So it is somewhat like your body armor, like your protective mechanism. The more muscle you have, the more capacity you have to survive basically any disease. And the more muscle you have, the more you're able to actually physically function as an older adult. So if you think about the trajectory of muscle span over someone's lifetime, or the amount of muscle you have, and we can talk a little bit about healthy versus unhealthy muscle as well, but healthy muscle over a lifetime, it peaks somewhere in 30, 35 years old. You're going to have the most muscle mass you'll ever have in your whole life. From there, unless you really, really work on it and you focus on eating adequate dietary protein and putting mechanical load on your muscle, i.e. resistance training, lifting heavy things, you will progressively lose that muscle over time. And that progression, you get to the point where you have such little muscle mass that you lose your ability to function. You move into disability. And that progression is basically called sarcopenia, and something that a lot of elderly individuals will die with or die from. If you don't have the physical capacity to hold yourself up and you fall and you break a hip, especially as you get later in life, your ability to bounce back from that injury is very, very low. So it really, just having muscle and making that the focus of your health, really like buffers against all kinds of things, chronic disease being one main one, but then just even the influence of aging on your body over time.
Yeah.
So the way that we practice medicine in the practice, muscle is the target for health. The way that we practice nutrition, kind of to go along with that, muscle is the target for health. Because if you have healthy, robust, growing skeletal muscle, everything else pretty much falls in line.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so with you. I wonder what the biggest barriers are, especially for women. I think the commonly cited thing is they're afraid that they're going to be like unattractive and huge, which is to me hilarious because I've been strength training like so much for 20 years, and my 13-year-old can like carry me around the house. Like, it's not like you're going to just suddenly turn into like a gigantic male looking crazy like beast. Right. It's wild to me that that's the thing. But I do think there might be a little bit more to it. I kind of wonder if it's like, okay, maybe not understanding the actual health benefits. And then if we talk about health benefits, often the discussion is centered around like, okay, here's what's going to happen to you when you're 80 then. And it's like, that's just so far away for them that's like, I've got bigger fish to fry. I've got to get dinner on the table. I've got kids to soccer. Like, I can't spend an hour in the gym lifting weights because of my 80-year-old life. So I think that what you kind of brought in is really important around, no, it has like endocrine and like, and metabolic consequences like right now for your life. And like, and literally if you're well muscled, like so many health problems will be they either will go away or never happen or get dramatically better.
Yeah. I had a really interesting conversation with a client last week actually, and she has a hemoglobin A1C of 5.8. So she's technically like pre-diabetic, on the way to like really, developed insulin resistance. And we were talking about how to design a diet that would kind of limit her carbohydrates. And she was really, really focused based on what she knew about limiting carbohydrates. Like, she needs to go on a low carbohydrate diet. And what I was trying to emphasize to her is that, yes, you can go on a low carbohydrate diet forever and your blood sugar will probably come down, like your HbA1c will lower if you're not putting that stimulus into the bloodstream to then keep your blood sugar high. Your blood sugar will go down. But by not addressing the exercise component, by not focusing on resistance training and building muscle, you're not actually improving your metabolic capacity at all. You're just removing a stimulus. Yeah. So it's like, I tried to explain it to her like this. Your muscle is like a sponge. And the bigger your sponge, the more food, if you think about food like water, the more you can absorb and hold safely, right? If you have a small sponge, it can only absorb so much water before it starts to overflow. And it's that overflowing, both of fats, fatty acids and glucose, that is really problematic and leads to chronic disease. So the bigger you can make your sponge, i.e., the
Yeah.
larger your skeletal muscle base, the less you have to worry about your food coming into the system being problematic, because you're more efficient at generating energy from that food, and you can kind of handle more in one go because your body has a place to put it.
Hmm.
And so I often use that sponge analogy for women, and say, like, you gotta, not only do you need to be building the size of your sponge by lifting weights, but you have to be working out with an intensity that encourages you to really squeeze your sponge out. Because the more you squeeze your sponge out and let it refill, the more efficient your body gets at doing that, because you're demanding that it do that over and over and over. And obviously, it's going to become more efficient over time.
Hmm.
And so that sponge analogy really hits home for people. Like, sometimes
Yeah,
it's like
it's
they
good.
have like this aha moment, like, whoa, I never thought of it that way. And then
Right.
in future sessions, I say, like, did you squeeze your sponge out this week? It's such an interesting prompt to use, and it is such a simple kind of thing for people to visualize. But if you are focusing just on what you're eating and cutting back on foods and going low carb, you're only addressing kind of the inputs to your system. You're
Yeah.
not addressing how efficient and well functioning your system is at a baseline.
Yeah, and one example of that is we know that, and I'm not anti-low carb diet, but we know that someone who's been on a prolonged low carb diet will typically become more insulin resistant, at least in the short term. Like, say they suddenly eat like a moderate to high carb meal, they'll be more insulin
Hmm.
resistant to that
Yeah. Yeah.
than before, because that sort of underlying, the sponge, as you're talking about, has not grown, and in fact, it may have shrunk.
Yes, totally.
Yeah,
Especially if there's an instance of calorie restriction,
right.
then and that's the scary part about fad diets, crash diets, and even these GLP-1 agonists that are coming out, the Ozempic drugs,
Mhm.
tirzepatide, because they are essentially encouraging people to eat so little that they do put muscle mass somewhat at risk. And when you're eating a calorie restricted diet, you're going to lose muscle mass on average on a diet that's calorie restricted, of the weight. If you do end up losing weight because you're cutting your calories significantly, um, sometimes up to 40, maybe even 50% of the weight you lose is actually muscle mass.
Right.
That is not what we want, because
No.
if you cannot eat on a calorie restricted diet forever, you are eventually, because of the survival mechanisms in the body, going to rebound eating to a normal kind of, like, to match your energy expenditure eventually. And when you do that, you are actually, your sponge is then smaller, like you're saying, and so you
Mhm.
have less capacity then to deal with the food you're now eating. So it puts people in this really, really kind of downward spiral, where they see kind of
Absolutely.
results of weight loss, they see the number on the scale dropping, but they don't really understand the nuance of what's happening to their body composition. And eventually what that leads to is you're basically just swapping your muscle mass that you had for fat over time.
Yes, exactly, and then every time they try to lose weight, it gets harder and harder. They keep gaining weight on what used to either help them maintain or help them lose, and
Yes.
the whole time, every time they crash diet, they lose their sponge shrinks. They lose muscle every time.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I know we just have like a few more minutes, but I think this ties into one thing I wanted to ask you of, in that context of like, okay, someone needs to lose weight, they're going to try to do it responsibly in terms of like not crash dieting. Um, what probably the most critical thing to protect lean mass is eating enough protein that people like us can help them, give them that number. But in order to actually achieve, like, know how much protein they're eating, I think there's a really I think you might not agree, but I think macro tracking is kind of a controversial thing, in the sense of, like, I saw on your Instagram, you're saying like it's really important. You're going to learn a lot about food. It's going to help you to, be more aware of what you're eating. And I think that's absolutely true. And I do use macro tracking, but then I think there's like the other side of the coin, where it's like some people will see it as disordered, or like overly obsessive, or too time consuming, or missing the greater point of nutrient density. And so kind of tell me how you tie together the two, like, sort of conflicting camps.
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation, and it is somewhat controversial. There are a lot of dietitians, nutritionists out there who take different viewpoints on this. I think it
Yeah.
depends on where they personally come from as well and their experiences with these tools. To me, I view it really as a tool. It's not necessarily appropriate for everyone. I will say I work with people who right out the gate they say I will not track, and that's okay. We can deal with that. There's lots of ways that we can quantify food that is not like actually counting calories per se. The trade-off is like if someone is outcome oriented, there are certain variables that are going to dictate that outcome. And so if you have an outcome that you have in mind, you need to control the variables. So for those people, the trade-off is I have an outcome, like I have a weight loss goal or I want to be a certain something in the future, then we really need to tightly control these things. And tracking to me is a way to do that. If you just want to develop really good habits, start focusing more on diet quality and nutrient density, it is by no means necessary. But diet nutrient density does not also mean weight management at the same time.
Right.
Those are to me two different things. So you can get
Yeah.
your diet quality and your nutrient density up really high, but you can overeat to get there. And that is an interesting situation to be in because, you know, I think when I did the math, you only need to overeat by like over your energy expenditure by 60 or 70 calories a day to be gaining
Yeah.
1 to 2 pounds a year.
Mhm.
So I do think if you think about the context of the world today, uh, you can walk into a Walmart and in one box get all the calories you need for like 3 days. So we live in a food environment that makes calories very easy to acquire. So sometimes, I mean, I do believe that, and I don't know what you think about this, and there's no science that I can refer to that backs this up. But I do think we have a tendency to overeat when given the opportunity because we are we've dealt with historically as humans like periods of feast and famine.
Right.
And eventually when we do overeat to a certain point, we become both insulin and leptin resistant, which then
Yes.
kind of like triggers a cascade of further amplifying that behavior.
Mhm.
So I do think when left to our own devices, we will overeat kind of in perpetuity if we're and that metabolic dysfunction kind of continues to perpetuate that.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a check and balance. If you cannot, and for someone who can do it on their own, like they have really good, um, they're not insulin resistant, they're metabolically functioning well, they're
You have like
they've
intact like appetite regulation.
exactly, yes, exactly. All of those hormones are working as they should, and their signaling is clear to all the cells, and everything is working well. Then I don't think tracking is necessary for those people.
Mhm.
But if you've tried year over year to get a handle on your eating and you just cannot seem to manage that, or you have specific goals to achieve, I definitely think tracking as a way to just recalibrate your understanding of how much you actually have to be eating and also what foods you're selecting in order to make that a reality for yourself
Yeah.
is a good exercise to do, even if it is somewhat temporary. Like, me
Mhm.
personally, I have tracked in the past. Do I track every day now? No. But
Right.
if I do feel like I've gone through a period where I'm really dysregulated or it's holidays or I've um, been really stressed or something disruptive has happened in my life, when I get to the other side of whatever that is, sometimes I will for a day or two just to like kind of snap me back to reality
Yeah,
of
I'm
here.
100% with you on it, and also as a learning tool for a time, and I find especially around the world of, like, what it really looks like to get a certain amount of protein. Like, I had somebody yesterday of, like, "I think I'm good on protein. I have peanut butter every morning." I'm like, "Ah!"
Ah,
Peanut butter
I
is
know.
not protein. So, I think
Exactly.
it
Yes.
when you
And
have when you're
and
yeah.
no, I think this is a perfect example because peanut butter is low protein, but it's also very expensive
Yeah,
calorically.
yeah.
So that's like a really dangerous misunderstanding for someone
Right.
to have.
Yeah.
I had a client once who she when we did her diet diary, she was eating 3 avocados worth of guacamole at lunchtime
Yeah.
because she thought that guacamole had a lot of protein. She thought that avocados had a lot of protein. And
Okay.
I'm like, "I love
Oh, no.
avocado, but
Same.
that's like 1,000 calories worth of avocado you're consuming in a day." Because
Yeah.
she's having 3 full avocados thinking that
Yeah.
they had a lot. So it's really like it gives you an idea, it gives you an opportunity to really fundamentally understand what components of, like, food does it bring to your diet and how
Mhm.
impactful are each of these individual pieces, which I think is sometimes, like, the difference for someone. Like, that
Yeah.
woman or your client, by switching from peanut butter to, like, eggs or chicken sausage or something different for breakfast, she's going to
Yeah.
fundamentally change her trajectory for the day. And in
It's
the same as
yeah.
my client, by leaving out those 3 avocado, she's literally cutting out 1,000 calories of avocado.
Right. Yeah. It's really hard to be accurate if you don't even know what the data is. So it
Yes.
can be useful in that way if someone's safe to do it. And you're right, it's not always the right thing for everybody. But yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, I used to work in this clinic where they had a bunch of vegan, vegetarian people that came there. And I wouldn't even argue against it. I would say, let's start out by calculating your protein needs and then go ahead and try to track macros for a few weeks, come back, let me know how it goes. And first it would start off with like, yeah, I think my protein's probably great. I'm like, okay, good. I'm glad you're getting the 90 grams of protein that you need on your vegan diet. And then every single time come back getting 25. And they would
Yeah.
be shocked. It's like, okay, well, let's start talking about the foods that are high in protein. It's like, if you don't measure something, you can't really like say much about it.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
do think most people who have never gone through this exercise really don't have any idea what they're eating.
No, no.
It's like,
Avocados have
and
zero protein.
yeah, I've used this analogy before too. It's like trying to walk around a room in the dark.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah, yeah.
you gotta turn the lights on so you don't, like, trip over all the furniture. You need to understand how to navigate that space. And
Mhm.
and to me, someone who says, like, tracking is unuseful or tracking is damaging, to me, it's somewhat ignorant because it's like, it's just an opportunity to learn more. And it's not a death sentence. Like, we're just
Right.
asking you to put your food in a food diary for a few days to see if you can glean anything from it.
Yeah.
And this also comes back to the idea of, like, um curiosity. It's like you want to be curious about one of the most important things you do every day, which is feeding yourself. Like, let's get curious about how to optimize this and make it better, or maybe find out, where you're falling short. It's not about, like, and so this is a difficult conversation for people who have sort of a disordered relationship with food
Yeah.
or have had eating disorders in the past, because the relationship with food comes with so much emotion and psychological kind of like baggage.
Yeah.
It's really hard to separate that because they can't view that data very
Mhm.
neutrally.
Right.
So for those who are in that situation, it is not a good strategy because
Right.
they will beat themselves up, and it will be really, really difficult to execute for them. It
Yeah.
will be almost like too disruptive to even be beneficial. But
Yeah.
for people who don't have that kind of history and who can use it as a kind of like a tool for gathering data, being curious, and viewing it somewhat neutrally, it is so, so beneficial.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah,
Julia, I feel like we could talk all day. I know I have to
I
let
know.
you go, but real quickly, tell where can people connect with you? How can they learn more about you? And also, of course, about Dr. Lyon and her practice.
Yeah, so I guess I have Instagram. I'm sometimes active, sometimes not, but it's at
Mhm.
Julia the Nutritionist. And then our practice, you can find me and work with me directly one on one in our nutrition practice, which is at drgabriellelyon.com. And otherwise, you can follow drgabriellelyon.com for her website, but her Instagram is also at Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and she is totally awesome. And everything she puts out is just awesome content. So you can follow her as well.
Thank you so much, Julia. We'll make sure to link everything in the show notes, and we would love to have you back anytime. Please hit us up because I think we just scratched the surface.
Totally. Yeah. I'm happy to come back anytime.
Great. Thank you. We'll talk to you next time then.
Okay. Thanks.
You too.